All right, and welcome back to our lecture series, guys. We're going to kick things right up with our with part two of our look at World War One. And to begin with, let me just say that industrial warfare was was a very horrifying experience to live through for this first generation that had to undergo it. This World War One generation. Germany, who was the dominant power of the Central Powers, faced the very difficult task of fighting two wars, of fighting a war on two fronts. It was really much more like just fighting two wars simultaneously. The First World War was the most destructive war up to that point, with millions of lives being lost and nations being completely wrecked as industrial warfare devastated Europe, Western Eurasia. The majority of the fighting was done in trenches, as the men had to conceal and protect themselves from the new frightening capabilities of the machine gun that made defensive positions so much easier to hold. For much of the war, defenders had to had a clear advantage over the attackers. The military innovations that had made the scramble for Africa and the Far East possible for Europeans now made warfare frustratingly difficult. Infantry units were literally just hamstrung. They were with great difficulty advanced against their enemies. A small band of men armed with machine guns were capable of annihilating an entire infantry division. Horseback Calvary, which dates to the first years of the early years of the domestication of the horse, and was a prominent feature of all standing armies around the world for literally over 2 millennia at that point. Really over 3 millennia at that point. Yeah, going way back into the thousands and thousands of BCs. Horseback cavalry simply disappeared from standing armies. It proved to be ruinous and had to be abandoned. One of the most ancient forms of warfare was made obsolete during the First World War. The First World War also introduced a brutality previously unknown in warfare. Has both sides used poison gas attacks against each other. They became very regular, the gas attacks. Both sides, in an effort to dampen war morale, bombed civilian populations, and the economies of the belligerents were diverted to their war effort, and really the entire populations were perverted by wild war propaganda. Now, as stated earlier, specific considerations had to be made with the understanding of political elites who wanted to spare the United States the horrors of an ethnic conflict. And an ethnic conflict ravaged areas like gangland centers like Chicago and New York. Wilson urged Americans to be neutral in thought and deed, and at the same time, many Americans were ardent pacifists. The Theo Baron Andrew Carnegie was a very notable pacifist. Jane Addams of the Hull House settlements in Chicago was another pacifist. Lillian Wald, a founder member of the NAACP and the founder of the Henry Street Settlement House in New York City, organized a peace march in New York City to protest the war. In the year prior to the outbreak of war, there had been a naval arms race between the German Imperial Navy and the British Royal Navy. And naval strength was a traditional cornerstone of the British foreign and domestic policy. And the British Navy, with the assistance of the French Navy, was able to hold the German Navy in check, maintaining surface control of the Atlantic Ocean after the Battle of Jutland, which was really an inconclusive exchange, much like Antietam had been, but was enough of a victory for the Entente to maintain the bottlenecking of the German fleet. And this allowed the surface fleet of the Anglo-French Navy to dominate throughout the war. Now, now, as the war dragged on, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, they all appealed to the United States to sell them more and more goods. And the United States agreed, citing her neutrality, and sent ships carrying goods to all three powers. In a move reminiscent of the stop and search seizures of American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars of the late 17th, early 18th, late 18th, early 19th centuries. The British and French fleets stopped and boarded American ships, and then they did this primarily to prevent them from going to German ports. This time, however, instead of simply seizing the ships or cargo or impressing men into service, the British and the French ships, they simply diverted ships heading to German ports to British and French ports. The American ship captains, they all grumbled at this high-handedness, but they accepted it. Had the French and the British governments bought their commodities as soon as they made it to port to use in their war effort. Now, the dominance of the British Navy had made it very difficult for them to really do anything about this at the time. Now that made the situation very dire. Foreign goods could not make it into Germany unless a British officer allowed an American vessel to pass into a German port. To make matters worse, the sinking of the Lusitania by the U-boat by U-boat 20 back in 1915 off the coast of Ireland sent this wave of anti-German hysteria throughout the United States. The Lusitania had been one of the great transoceanic liners of her day, just as grand and as famous as the Titanic had been. Now, the Lusitania was sunk by a submarine, which was a new terror weapon. Whose technology was rapidly improving, and the Germans were very, very good at waging war beneath the waves. The Germans very early on achieved a mastery beneath the waves. They were quite successful at contesting the British Royal Navy and the British and the French merchant marines. They would typically surface and fire a warning shot across the bow of the merchant vessel. After that, they would wait until the ship was abandoned, and then they would sink it. Now, the British responded by simply arming its merchant ships, which led to the Germans simply not surfacing and thus not giving any warning before it fired torpedoes. Now, this was because the submarine is incredibly vulnerable when it surfaces. They could not afford to surface and be damaged. And at the time, the Germans claimed that the Lusitania were carrying military supplies in addition to civilian passengers. Now, the British government back in 1915, 1916 hotly denied that this was true. But we have learned that indeed the Lusitania were carrying military supplies from the United States into Great Britain. Now, Wilson, again fearful of angering ethnic voting blocs, decided to send a diplomatic note of protest against the intolerable acts of the German government. Wilson's letter was phrased in such a way and denoted such an angry tone that it implied that the United States would go to war over this issue. The then sitting Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, begged him not to send it. Wilson sent the note over his objections, and Bryan promptly resigned in protest. With the loss of Bryan, the Wilson administration lost one of its most conciliatory members and most respected figures. Great Britain and France were buying all that they could from the United States, and eventually this led to them depleting their stockpiles, their stores of United States currency. They simply ran out of dollars to buy any of the cargo, any of the goods from the ship captains. This in turn led the British and French government to seek out loans from American bankers so that they can continue to buy American goods from ships they wanted to divert from heading into Germany. The bankers, in turn, approached the Wilson administration, seeking to act if it was appropriate for them to extend credit to these nations currently at war. The bankers were very keen to make the loans and to extend credit to the British and the French governments. The bankers thought that they would make a very tidy profit off the interest that came from the loans. Wilson favored the loans, had the means of aiding the British war effort, and there was a great fear regarding what would happen if the British and the French stopped making purchases. The fear was that if Great Britain and France, if they don't purchase our goods, then the entire economy is going to collapse, because they're the ones purchasing the food and the war materials being sent over to Europe. And with that, we will sort of transition into American interests. Now, the United States economy was roaring at this point, mainly due to the high sales of foodstuffs, munitions, and other industrial products. And had stated that there was a fear that there would be an economic recession and massive unemployment if the loans were not extended to Great Britain and France. Wilson was an open admirer of the British system of Great Britain. He wrote books during his tenure as a professor at Princeton that largely reflected his admiration for the British political system. His works also called for reforms in the American political system that would mirror the British system. His replacement for William Jennings Bryan as Secretary of State was Robert Lansing of New York, and his Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, a noted Dixiecrat, all sided with Wilson and advocated for the British. There was also an ethnic argument that was used to favor Great Britain over Germany, namely that there was a shared ethnic destiny of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, and that argument rested on the belief that the Anglo-Saxons had been chosen by divine providence to achieve greatness, and that what was good for one group of Anglo-Saxons will be good for another group of Anglo-Saxons. Now, around this time, Wilson was running for re-election, and the war dominated the campaign. Wilson's slogan had been, he kept us out of war, though privately he often commented that at any moment a new German offensive could catapult the Republic into war. By early 1917, the Germans had decided to embark on a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and this was justified on the ground that the United States was not a neutral power due to the fact that they were giving so much aid to Great Britain and France. The German pointed to the fact that the United States did not protest internationally when British and French ship captains escorted them to French or British ports, diverting them from their mission to trade with German ports. And they also objected to they also pointed to the fact that the United States had loaned money to Germany and had loaned money to the United Kingdom and to France when they could not afford to buy those goods, that they simply loaned them the money just so that they would be able to buy the goods. The German pointed to all these reasons as justification for arguing that they could attack United States shipping since the United States was not a neutral power. Now, the Germans, at this point, many people suspect that the Germans simply foresaw the entry of the United States into the war and sought to gain a bit of a breathing space. Now, the United States shortly afterwards declared war, and as noted earlier, had a very small military. Because the United States had such a small military, the declaration of war against Germany in 1917 necessitated the buildup of a fighting force and the equipping of a fighting force capable of engaging the forces of Germany and France. Now, this meant that the United Kingdom and France will be left to their own devices until the United States deployed their forces in Europe. Now, the German policy of unrestricted warfare was very successful. In the first 2 weeks, over 255,000 tons of shipping had been sunk. Admiral William Sims, the commander of the U.S. naval forces operating in the in European waters, was astonished to discover this fact after he crossed the telegraph. Now, one factor confronted Wilson early on, and that was that the country was not generally enthusiastic about going to war. For many Americans on the West Coast in particular, but also on the Western Plains and much of the former Louisiana Purchase country that now makes up a great portion of the United States Midwest and West. Europe seemed remote and distant. They had no interest or desire to send their sons off to fight for others so far removed from themselves. Wilson was able to bring the Westerners around by use of the Zimmerman telegraph. Now, the Zimmerman telegraph is a secret document that was supposedly uncovered by British operatives that detailed a secret plot between the German and Mexican governments. The plot involved the German government facilitating the Mexican government reacquisition of the Mexican cession lost at the conclusion of the Mexican War, and also Texas. Mexico will regain the Mexican cession and Texas in exchange for aid against Great Britain and France. Now, this galvanized Americans in the far west. They were very loath to lose their citizenship or their homes for that matter. Now, as the United States began its buildup for the war, the military officials were confident that they were confronted by a few startling facts. For the first time, recruits were forced to undergo IQ tests that reflected negatively upon them, especially among immigrants. These tests did not test for innate intelligence, but rather were culturally biased devices. Another great shock was that as the men went in for their physicals to test their fitness for military duty, 30% of the recruits had to be rejected due to poor nutrition, industrial injuries, nearsightedness, and the most striking debilitation due to lack of access to good medicines. American healthcare at this time was incredibly rudimentary. 31% of the men were also illiterate, and in the end, 24 million men had been registered for military service, and 2.8 million were drafted into the armed forces. Now, this led to the rapid rise of military camps across the United States. Before then, there never really was any sort of early training for the military unit. You would simply learn as you went about doing your martial business. But these camps were constructed to provide basic training to the men before they shipped out. And at the camps, the YMCA arrived and began to offer religious services to the men. They also offered food and wholesome entertainment. Now, outside of the camps, bars and brothels and gambling dens sprang up, which created quite a sight as moral crusaders who thought of the First World War as a democratic crusade. They were all dismayed to find that the men going off to fight the war, to fight this moral crusade, were all living in moral squalor. Now, at the time, the United States government did not recognize conscientious objectors. So the peace churches like the Society of Friends or the Mennonites, who had long-standing traditions of nonviolence going back into the colonial period, they became vulnerable to prison persecution, and this led to the imprisoning of many Mennonites who were mistreated for their supposed cowardice. Now, the Wilson administration also adopted the slogan, "We are fighting a war to end all wars," and early on initiated a dramatic propaganda campaign that aimed to draw the civilian population into the war effort. They can now draw young men into the war effort, and they can also attract older men to purchase war bonds. Now, the 4-Minute Men had to recall made appeals at dance halls, theaters, and other public venues. And this campaign was very successful with the American population. The only group who remained unenthusiastic about the war were the American socialists. They viewed the war as a capitalist struggle, and that the capitalist nations should tear at each other. They were members of the global working class and had no possible interest in the outcome of a capitalist war. Eugene Debs and the American socialites, socialists, I should say, not socialites. Debs, who was their leader, he became an outspoken critic of the war, and eventually was imprisoned by wartime legislation passed that sort of outlawing or severely curtailing freedom of speech under the Wilson administration. Debs, he would appeal his conviction, but his conviction would be upheld by the United States Supreme Court, and it sort of added to the unfavorable aspects of the United States during the First World War, as this was an unprecedented curtailment of American civil liberties. One group that was swept up in the war fever was American clergymen, who gave these sort of cataclysmic sermons reminiscent of the ancient Assyrians in terms of graphic violence. And with that, we'll break and we'll come back to sort of wrap up our look at World War I. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.